in 2050, we're talking about a 95% reduction in the carbon emissions that we use today. And we're not going to get there simply by switching to renewable sources of energy. We're going to get there by changing our lifestyle, by the way our businesses change their business models, and that will be the future.
Reality. So when our prime minister is saying, oh, we're going to reduce single-use plastic that's going out the front door, I've been saying, reduce the plastic that's coming in the back door.
That generation that came through the Depression, we learn a lot from them. You know, those people used everything. They valued the things they had.
Hello there. Right, welcome to Climate Forum. Climate Forum happens every third Thursday. As you probably know by now, we're formerly known as Cat Grey Bruce, the climate action team. If you haven't attended this year and you didn't know that, where have you been? Well, we've simplified what we do. We're a forum now. We bring together people from north and south and east and west here in the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation to discuss climate and hopefully empower some people to act on climate and to create great marches like we had back in the fall or projects. And so, yeah, that's the point of tonight. It's as usual, it's a third Thursday where everyone is welcome. It's a safe space for all. And the topic tonight is reduce. And in preparing for tonight, I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. We had a survey and we surveyed all our mailing lists. This was the highest voted topic by you, the viewers. And this was consumption and reducing footprint. It won out of all the topics. So this is our stab at this an important topic from a perspective of living in Grey Bruce. Joachim and I are your hosts as usual, and we're only your hosts. None of us are experts. We're not here. None of us are perfect. Despite all we do to limit our own footprints, we're just here to share the stories and to learn together. And that's why it's pretty inclusive tonight. And like I said, a safe space, because we understand that we're all doing our best. And yeah, you're welcome. Hello.
Yeah, hello, everybody. So tonight we meet to discuss and find ways forward, tackling our climate crisis through reducing our consumption and with it our carbon footprint. And wherever we are, we acknowledge that we gather on indigenous land represented in our area by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, consisting of communities of Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation at Neashe-Inik Mi'ing. We also recognize these as the lands of the Métis Nation of Ontario. By gathering on these lands, we are all treaty people with all the relations and responsibilities that entail. So good evening, everybody. And over to you again, Lee.
Thanks, man. Hey, like I said, tonight is reduce. But tonight is also a paradigm shift. And we did part one back in May, how to talk with your neighbors about climate. And the takeaway there was to make climate action relevant and meet your neighbors in a safe, in their space, speak their language, issues important to them, make climate action relevant. Tonight again is paradigm shift. So we do it twice a year, and it's a deep dive into a potentially transformative topic for residents of rural Ontario here. We all remember the slogan, reduce, reuse, recycle. We're going to explore the first one, reduce. And like I said, I'll tell you a little bit more about what happened when we decided on reduce as a topic. After we surveyed you last winter on what topics you wanted to explore, Joachim and I knew now that we're going to host this discussion. We're going to examine who, what, where, when, and why of consumption. We started asking around about who wanted to talk about reduce and reducing their own footprint, and not many people really wanted to be put on a pedestal and share their story. But we had some great replies though to the emails that we sent out. The first one that I'll point out real quick is we had one come in from Thorsten Arnold, a regenerative farmer in Parkhead. And Thorsten said to explore why do we need to reduce? We should be thinking about why do we need to consume? And what I took away from Thorsten's email is that consumption creates sort of a meaning in our lives. And if we take that away, we have to, it's intrinsically tied to meaning. So we need to look at what outcomes we want. If the goal is to reduce, we should see if we can get to the underlying root cause instead of just treating the symptoms of consumption. And then we had another reply come back by email in the lead up to this. How do you reduce? Julie Lamberts wrote to us and said, well, she actually focuses on what she needs versus what she wants. She'll slap a paint on something and try and push its lifespan for another year. Even with her business, she avoids advertising as much as she can because she knows that if she knows something exists, then she might want it. And if nobody knows it exists, then nobody really wants it. So she had some great replies. But tonight's all about give and take with you as well. In the later part of tonight, we'll hear about how you reduce. And to contribute, you would just click on the link in the chat. It's shortened linked, but it'll take you to a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard. And you'll see you can just click on that link in the chat or copy and paste it if the click doesn't work. And you will get a whiteboard where you can add a sticky note and tell us how you reduce. And we're going to visit those at the end of the night of what you contributed. Now, who should reduce? The who, what, where, when, why? Well, that's what our first speaker is going to speak on. John Anderson is with us. That's where we bring him into the conversation. I'll just say quickly, last week on Ontario Today, I heard Mike Schreiner, the provincial Green Party leader, and Seth Klein, an author, they were both on Ontario Today, saying that personal reductions in carbon footprints are dwarfed by the decisions and targets that different levels of government make. John's our resident of Georgian Bluffs here, and he's our climate scientist, retired Department of Fisheries and Oceans, marine biologist with Memorial University. And of course, we mostly know him in this area from co-producing the resilience film, Transforming Our Community in 2019. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to John Anderson to talk a bit more about that.
I'm here. I think my mic's on. And so I'm going to share my screen now, Lee. Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight. I think this forum that Lee and Joachim run is just a great platform and a great meeting space, especially in this time of COVID. When I was talking with Lee and we were setting this up and reduce, he referred to this this three-legged stool, calling it society stool of government, community, and corporations. And Lee wanted me in particular to speak about the role of corporations in reducing our impact on this planet and reducing the energy that we consume and reducing the fossil fuels that we burn. But just to put this in context, while I will talk about corporations, it's impossible to talk about reducing without involving all three of these actors. I mean, they're all on stage at the same time, and what one does affects the other, and they're very, very much interacting. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And I would even say that this might be a fourth-legged stool, because nonprofits now form a very big part in action and doable groups within society. And I think I will apologize a little bit, because this talk is going to be a bit academic, because when we was talking with Lee and I agreed to do this, I immediately have gone and drawn on material that I have been teaching at the Georgian College in recent years. And so I'm coming at this pretty much from a teacher-student standpoint. And so that's sort of my disclaimer at the beginning. When I talk at the college, when I teach at the college up there, I talk about the sustainability stool, and it's a four-legged stool, and it's typically represented as these four nested spheres, where the outer one is the environment, with the understanding that society cannot exist without a sustaining environment from which we get so many of our ecosystem services. And inside that is culture, and culture is so important, because that's what shapes our moral and ethical values. Those are the values that guides a society. And then within the culture is our society. And to have an economy, you have to have a stable and functioning society. And the economy and society, they interact over quite quick time scales compared to culture. Culture does change, but it changes slowly. And then our environment, of course, it changes really slowly, at least up to the point where you reach a tipping point, and then the regimes can change very, very quickly. So that's sort of the theoretical background of going forward. So jumping to corporations, here's a definition of a corporation that was published very recently by the Harvard Law School. And it states that the purpose of a corporation is to conduct a lawful, ethical, profitable, and sustainable business in order to create value over the long term, which requires consideration of the stakeholders that are critical to its success. So it sounds like a lawyer would write that. But the key word here is stakeholders, because corporations operate pretty much for the benefit of their stakeholders that are exclusively their shareholders. And the corporation's single purpose is to create money, to create value for their shareholders. But in this case, the Harvard Law School is talking about a different set of stakeholders. And those stakeholders are much broader, involving society. So they go on to say there is a growing view that corporations should take into account environmental, social, and governance issues, the ESG issues. And this is also known and referred to as social corporate responsibility. And so this really forms a model for where we see corporations going in their role in the future, not just making money for their shareholders, but creating value for society that takes into account environmental and governance and social issues. So we look at our economies and we look at our economic performance and how well we're doing as a society based on a single metric, and that's gross domestic product, or GDP. And this is a nation's aggregate production in a period of time, and it's a measure of economic performance and also wealth. And this GDP was created by an economist back in the 1930s for FDR in the States. And it was specifically so he could evaluate the degree to which his New Deal policies were actually working. And it's been our single metric ever since. This definition I've taken from the Canadian Index of Wellbeing Report, 2016. And they go on to say that typically our economic performance outpaces our quality of life. And this is at the very heart of the issue of growing inequality. And this inequality is a big deal. And we right now are at quite high economic and wealth inequality in our country, and it continues to grow. Inequality is income and wealth, but it's also is gender, racial, cultural, just to mention five. And economists have demonstrated that the level of inequality we're at now, we've only reached that twice before in the last 300 years of our existence of modern society. The last time we were at such high inequality, income and wealth inequality as we are now, was just over 100 years ago, at the end of the 1800s, just prior to the First World War. That First World War was devastating, and it was followed almost immediately by the Second World War. And together, those were huge forces that somewhat leveled the inequality that had been allowed to occur by the time of the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Chases by the beginning of the 20th century. And the other time that happened was back in the late 1700s, just before the French Revolution in 1792. And we all know what happened then. And so history has told us that this kind of inequality that we have is not sustainable by society, and large adjustments will take place. And that large adjustment is almost certain to come in our near or foreseeable future. Why did we get this great inequality? Because following the Second World War, the equality was down in an area that economists felt was good and stable for our society. And it's traced back to what's become known as trickle-down economic theory, attributed to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is a famous economist from the Chicago School of Economics. More formally, it's known as neoliberalism or neoliberal economic theory. And a formal definition of that is that, in theory, lowering taxes on businesses and the wealthy will stimulate economic growth and benefit all of society. And you hear of these phrases like the invisible hand of the market. And this is basically the core behind this trickle-down economic theory. A much more cynical definition is that it's the principle that the poor, who must subsist on table scraps dropped by the rich, can best be served by giving the rich bigger meals. Well, this economic theory has been in play for 50 years now, and we know that that has not worked. It's often referred back to Reaganomics, because Ronald Reagan, when he came to power in the early 1970s, he adopted the theory of Milton Friedman. In fact, Milton Friedman was his top economic advisor, and Milton Friedman also was the top economic advisor of Margaret Thatcher. And so this phrase, you see Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Dick Cheney and others. Then I told them not to worry, the wealth would trickle down. Well, the wealth has not trickled down, and the level of inequality we have right now is considerable, and it's growing. Last year, the Parliamentary Budget Officer in Canada reported that the top 10% of wealthy Canadians own 49% of the wealth, compared to the lower 80% who owned 33% of the wealth. And so on average, the wealthy Canadians had 12 times the wealth that the lower 80% of us had. And that inequality has been growing and continues to grow, and it's not sustainable. Well, what is the future? I was quite taken when Mark Carney published this book earlier this year, but it was the title that caught my eye, because it's called Values. And you remember, Mark Carney's a banker. He was the former banker of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of Canada and of the Bank of England. He's now a UN special envoy, and has recently brokered a quite landmark deal with top financial and corporation institutions about making climate transparency built right into the economic models that they've got. And this is the marketing for this book is that it's an urgent argument on the radical foundational change that is required if we were to build an economy and a society based not on market values, but on human values. And this is the core message. This is not the only book. There's a rich literature on this. And it's basically moving from using GDP as our single measure of how well we're doing to these indices of well-being. And it's a matter of values. It's a matter of the moral and ethical values that we build into our economy and into our society. He says that our fundamental problems stem from this crisis of values, and that this book, and he shows how market economies have evolved into market societies where the price determines the value of everything. Well, one of the very first books I read on this was by Raj Patel, and his title was The Value of Nothing. And it was the same thing. It was the same theme. And so this is the economic framework that I am quite certain we will see in the future when this current economic system finally breaks down and we shift forward, that we will be looking where we're putting value on the human values that are represented by indices of well-being, and not just on corporations making money. Well, I want to continue now, a bit of a history lesson. This is the great acceleration that I talk to the students about. I'm just going to begin with a very brief review of exponential growth. I mean, we all took this in school, we all know. We're probably even more aware of it now with the COVID virus, because each wave has followed an exponential increase in the number of cases. But just review so you know what we're talking about. It starts with some quantity here on the left. Could be bunny rabbits, could be dollars. And you start with 1 at time step 0. We're going to grow this at 2.5% each time step, and we're going to go for a total of 250 years. At 2.5%, starting with 1, after 250 time steps, you're up at 500. That's exponential growth. And this is the scale. If we say this was our economies and the time step were years, this is approximately the time since the beginning of the first industrial revolution. Here's global GDP. And you can see from 1750, the time when James Watt perfected his efficient steam engine, his two-stage combustion steam engine, until now, that our GDP has increased exponentially. And you'll notice that the sharp rise following the Second World War as productivity rose. With that, our populations have grown. And history has shown us, economists have built these indices back for millennia, back to 2,000 years and really more, that in the past, whenever GDP went up, like during the time of the Roman Empire, for example, populations went up. So population is linked to wealth. But societies and empires can't run on energy. And so here we see expressed in fossil fuel emissions globally, that so have our global carbon dioxide emissions been rising. And these increases have been occurring slowly following the exponential growth. And in fact, our economic target is to grow at 2.5 to 3% a year. And we've been doing that, but especially since the Second World War. In fact, our economic growth in many of these years was much higher than 3% a year. And so here's where we are now. And you have to ask the question, okay, how much farther are we going to go on this trajectory? Because we all know exponential growth in a closed system, and planet Earth is a closed system, exponential growth is not sustainable forever. And when we look at the GDP, which is in green, and emissions in here in orange or tan per capita, we see that there's been an incredible increase in GDP per person. So our wealth per person since the late 1800s has grown by a factor of 12. And more astoundingly, our emissions have grown by a factor of over 30. And it really begs the question, how much is enough? And this is the sort of my theme behind Reduce, because we're living way beyond our needs of where we need to be in terms of wealth and energy. And the tragedy of this, as I talk to the students, is this wealth and this energy use is not spread equitably. It's very unequally distributed at this point in time. Well, here's a recent headline, early October. Canadians are among the world's worst carbon emitters, and here's what we can do about it. This was based on a report out of a Berlin think tank, but it's just an example. Here are our emissions per capita, and there's Canada at 14.8, and then I've picked a few representative countries here: China, Germany, United Kingdom, Western countries that we might compare ourselves to, Sweden and Norway. And you can see we're way behind them, or way above them, if you like, in terms of our emissions. And for Canada to meet our commitments of reduction now that are in law in Canada to be net zero by 2050, we have to reduce these emissions from an average of 14.8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents each year down to a factor of 1 or less. So we've got a long ways to go in terms of reducing our energy use and reducing our emissions. So the theme here is, yes, we will move to low carbon and zero carbon energy sources, but very important, we're not going to get there unless we reduce the amount of energy that we use, which is very much wrapped up in our lifestyles, which is very much wrapped up in our values. Now, this is something I could have been one of these speakers, because I can make a whole talk on this. I've worked quite a bit with carbon footprint calculators and personal footprint calculators, and I'm just going to hit the highlights of this. This is the personal carbon footprint of a young family living in Southern Ontario of 4 people, 2 parents, 2 young kids that are in elementary school. One of the parents is a casual worker, working shift work, no benefits. The other is a professional with a salary and benefits. And their average carbon footprint in their household is 15 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year, just just over the Canadian average. And I've broken their many ways of calculating this down into 3 categories: transportation, housing, and lifestyle. And so the challenge here, and as you work with these calculators and you game them, how do we get these emissions down? You can see transportation is the largest category. And when they work with this, they work to reduce this, they have 2 gas-powered vehicles. They can switch to hybrids and reduce their carbon emission. They can't go to EVs because particularly one of the parents drives just over an hour to work and back, and there's no charging infrastructure that would support it. So their option right now would be to move to hybrids. They've dropped their one and only family flight each year and now stay at home in this scenario. And the professional, she has dropped 1 or 2 flights, but her job actually demands that she flies. And so this then becomes part of the system. This becomes part of her carbon footprint, can only go so low because as her job is constructed now, for her to be successful, or her to reach promotion, she's got to fly. When it comes to the house, they can reduce the amount of energy they use. They can turn their heat down. But here in Ontario, our electricity carbon footprints are fairly small because of the nuclear power that we have. They heat with gas, and quite frankly, with a mortgage, they can't afford to rip out their relatively new gas furnace place and put in air-to-air heat pumps. So again, this is where governance would come in, subsidizing that kind of transition to get this down, because they can't do it on their own. And then there's lifestyle, and there's many, many categories here. But look how big it still is. Their main, if you break these down, there's this calculator that I use has 14 different categories. Their largest one is their food and their drink. They are largely vegetarian already, but they're tilting more that way all the time, so they can reduce some of their footprint there. But they largely, they go to the market on the weekends when they have time, but their food largely comes through the supply chains. And our food and drink supply chains have high carbon footprints. So again, this is the system. This is the system that's preventing them reducing this anymore. And surprisingly, when you go down through this list and we looked at the next highest categories, it was in the financial sector. Their mortgage, which is fairly high, has a huge carbon footprint. And the insurance that they have in their capital assets is almost as big. And when you look at that, this is the financial and banking sector, the insurance sector. They have a huge carbon footprint. Not just in the way they conduct their businesses, because they fly executives around, they're high carbon, their employees commute, but it's also how they invest their money. And so the story here is to go from 15 tons to 9, which is what my schematic is representing here, by 2030, 8 years from now. There's no way this family of 4 can make it on their own, which goes back to Mike Schreiner's and Seth Klein's comment about the importance of corporations, the importance of governance, and making that transition. And then, of course, to hit this target in 2050, we're talking about a 95% reduction in the carbon emissions that we use today. And we're not going to get there simply by switching to renewable sources of energy, to low carbon sources of energy. We're going to get there by changing our lifestyle, by the way our businesses change their business models. And that will be the future if we are to reach our target in 2050. And so what we talk about at the college is the fundamental transformation that our society will undergo to make that into a sustainable future. So that's all I have to say here tonight.
John, thanks for making it come full circle and bringing it back to households and governments, the onus on government, and making that clear for us. Joachim, you've been keeping an eye on the chat. Were there any questions for John?
Well, right now they're coming in, but somebody, it's Bob, who says the empty shelves in BC may be showing the high energy requirements of the current system, which do not rely on local supply. That's interesting, right? So much of our food system is relying on transportation, which is part of the whole system, part of the corporate system, I guess. You would agree with that, John? Like
our modern agriculture, it's often referred to as agribusiness, and there's definitely a carbon footprint in our long supply chains, and you could even just call that an energy footprint. But there's huge carbon footprints in our agriculture sector, just the way the food is grown with highly mechanized. And then there's another very significant component in terms of land use change. As we cut down forests and clear away these natural areas for planted crops. So you combine all these together, and there's a very large carbon footprint from our foods.
Yeah, but also including the transportation, right? Which shows so much in BC right now. So there's some from Thorsten. How are returns from investments factored in stuff like pension funds and stock market investments?
So you go to a financial institution, say it's a bank, and you borrow money for your mortgage. You're borrowing from their financial assets, which are huge, and their goal is to grow those financial assets. So a huge part of their carbon footprint is the way they've invested that money. And you go and look at their portfolios, and you'll find huge investments in the fossil fuel sector. They also hide the impacts of these investments on climate change. And so if you remember Blair Feltmate talking last month to us about the rising costs of insurance, those are largely hidden by the way they invest their money. And this is why this deal that Mark Carney has been brokered there less than 2 weeks ago to build climate transparency and climate accountability into the financial sector is something that's absolutely crucial to tilting that away from the fossil fuel investments that they have.
Yeah, there are several questions about the financial sector and the carbon footprint. This one, how can we find out more about the financial sector's carbon footprint and let our insurance companies know we need change?
It's pretty easy. There's a huge divestment campaign out there, so there's an awful lot of information from not-for-profits on the divestment out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, which means if I personally try to reduce my footprint, but I have a mortgage, then the greenhouse gas emissions related to my mortgage is much higher than what I can do personally, right?
Yeah. So if you take this game with this family of 4 that I had, to get rid of their mortgage right now, to get rid of that carbon footprint, they'd have to sell their house, and they'd have to move into a zero carbon building, which doesn't exist, not in their area of Ontario, and completely give up the lifestyle that they have in order to get their carbon footprint down without the system having changed at all. And the system wouldn't miss them, to be quite honest.
Yeah, so we need a systems change, and there's a good question about it. Can governments incentivize corporations to reduce their consumption, energy, materials, and so on, enough to see real improvements? So what would be the role of governments in all that, the impact on corporations?
What the governments have a huge role to incentivize. There's a huge and primary role. And one of the best examples I was looking at recently was the way European countries tax gas in their countries compared to how we tax it here, and the huge effect it has on the size of vehicles that people buy and the distances they drive, and of course their willingness to use public transit. And that's an economic driver incentivized by government policy that simply makes it expensive to drive. Just like, well, that's enough.
So John, I'm sure if I know you well enough, you'll be active in the chat there as well. And just to nip in the bud any more audio, we'll move on. But the takeaway, that I took away from especially the pie charts of your personal footprint is that there's a lot to bring back in the lifestyle, but also in the stuff that can be regulated. You're welcome. If it's all right, we'll go into our next person. next panelist could not make it. He's an amazing person to talk to, so it behooved me to pre-record an interview with him. And we do everything live here. We've done everything live so that you can interact with everyone all year long, but this is the first time we're actually going to show you something that we taped. I got 10 minutes to sit down with Grant Nicholson, who is building his own tiny home. So he's making it not only tiny, off-grid, is also using mostly repurposed materials. So old pieces of styrofoam, cedar rails, wood logs, and he's an amazing man. But without further elaboration, I'll show you the interview I held with him just yesterday, him knowing that we were talking about these subjects. So here's an interview. It's 9 minutes long with Grant Nicholson. Grant, thanks for joining us. I have about 100 questions about your tiny home, but for the sake of time, maybe you could just tell me a little bit about your experience. Tony, how many tiny homes or thoughtful builds have you completed?
Well, it started for me when I decided to build my own full-size house, and it's 2,200 square feet. It has a 30 by 30 cathedral ceilinged art studio in it and so on. So, a much larger build, but it was also alternative in that it was a cordwood build. And that's where I really learned a lot. I didn't have any real prior construction experience in a formal way, but I've always been around it, and pulled off a large project like that myself, which was a timber frame with walls of cedar rails and highway guardrails and mortar. It was an incredible labor. It took many years to complete that one. And I've always had an affinity for the thought of doing that at a small scale. The idea that you can take whatever dream you have and execute it to its absolute fullest because of the small size and cost of a smaller space makes a lot of sense to me. There are obviously a lot of other ramifications as well. But then in getting involved in that, these alternative projects tend to attract quite a community, and I've spent time helping other people with their projects as well. So, you eventually sort of start to build a picture and a series of opinions about how all these things can work.
Can you tell us a bit about the trouble you went to in reusing all the materials in your tiny home build, and maybe why you went to all that trouble? So
I think we can look at sustainability and the use of materials in many different ways. For me, sometimes the technology and sometimes less desirable materials are actually the better thing to do, provided that you're going to get the life out of them. Everything causes a footprint, and we don't all pick up every worm or re-straighten out every blade of grass that we flatten as we pass through this life. The act of creating a home or a structure that dates as long as humans have needed shelter, we still have evidence of all kinds of buildings all over this earth that were well built out of stone and other raw materials. I think that we leave a footprint, and it's up to us to make sure that that footprint counts. So in the case of a small home that I'm hoping to retire in, I want it to be of super high quality. I don't want there to be cavities in it where bugs can accumulate and rot and create musty smells. I don't want it to be a place that has exposure to moisture in the wrong places. So for me, this build had a lot to do with A, the longevity, and B, something suitable to transport into an environment where you don't want to leave a big track, where you're not wanting to carry all kinds of heavy machinery and things in, but to bring something that doesn't disturb the local thing. So in this case, we wanted to go up a 40-foot cliff. I needed materials that could be lightweight, that would satisfy my longevity requirements, and that would be assemblable on site without customization. So going into the wild and truly into the forest, carrying in all of that stuff took more planning. So structural panels, one very quick way to have fewer pieces. They have no cavities in them. So if you sandwich styrofoam and plywood together, you create something that has an incredible quality, and it's very applicable to that circumstance. A timber frame is something you can make in advance and bolt together. I think all of my choices in this particular location were based on that. The future of it, which is slip forming it with stone, Those are all found materials that are local to the scenario, and I can take them in small batches. So the main thing was actually having a structure.
So it sounds like it was a lot of thought put into the design.
My design background is actually as graphics. I stepped into running machinery in large printing companies and doing the artistic design behind publications 30 years ago now, I guess. And but I then used those same tools to design my house and other buildings and structures and things of varying scale. So I think that we sometimes pigeonhole ourselves. It's amazing what one person can do with the modern world.
Right on. So the tiny home that you're building right now sounds like it's a very individual, like it's for your own, it's obviously for you. Are you offering these services to other people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And particularly if I had the chance to do things that had more embellishment. I have a fascination with cathedrals and things. I would love to be creating small British follies that people could actually live in. I think it'd be a fantastic way to go beyond just the obvious of a small, well-built space. We have the ability to create some artistic marvels that we wouldn't dare to do anymore with our typical bungalow construction.
You're building out of a lot of, with a lot of thoughtful design. Do you think the, more broadly and maybe more philosophically, do you think like the onus is on the individuals like ourselves to impact the land a little less, or do you think the onus really to fight the climate crisis and the planetary crises that are happening? Do you think the onus is on government or corporations, or is it the individual, or is it everybody?
I can tell you exactly what I think. The problem is where the rubber hits the road, where the hammer hits the head of the nail. We spend way too much time in our world in abstraction. The simple answer to this is that people need to engage with their own world and the ground beneath their feet. If you do that, you can't deny what is needed to happen. That is the only answer. Everybody has their own way of experiencing our planet. Clicking like in a Facebook app or talking about it is not going to change a person. And I have been fundamentally changed by my engagement with the North, its logging, and subsequently my use of such materials on a daily basis here. And my change is one that I can't help. I didn't need any kind of abstract product to discover that this has to be different.
Grant, we did a segment on how to talk to neighbors about climate change, and this was a while back earlier this year. The takeaway was that we all had, or most of us had, was you have to listen to neighbors, you have to meet them in their own space, you have to make issues about environmentalism or climate or waste, you have to make it relevant to them. If you see a behavior that you know is impacting the land, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I don't think that we can impose this on people. Right now, if my neighbors are people who are retiring, who are settled into the outplay of everything that they've done, it's pretty hard to get them to change. Those are people that are in a fixed state, or at least they perceive it that way. That isn't everybody, obviously, and we need to cherish that isn't always the case, because the people who also have time maybe did accumulate enough wealth to go out and take up a cause. The rest of us, while we're working full time and trying to contribute to this world, we need to find real ways to integrate that, and you'll only set an example. You can't cause someone to change. I find there's a lot of kickback to those conversations. I approach them carefully. You know, if you don't actually walk up to a mine, if you haven't actually walked through a clear cut or been part of an aggregate experiment somewhere, then it's pretty easy for that to just be a background thing, just like starving Africans. You know, we haven't solved that problem as long as I've been alive. I just turned 50. I mean, it doesn't make it any better to put it on a screen somewhere. So the people who are in denial, they're able to deny. And if you look at what people's biggest issue is with taking action in today's world, you got to start with understanding the people, and we need to understand ourselves. That's part of the problem. We keep looking outside of it, but if you got a whole bunch of people with an identity crisis, Do you think that those people who are struggling for the next consumer product to try to solve it because we've exploited that so much are about to actually just drop everything in the face of, wow, I have one droplet in this giant bucket and I can make a difference? You're asking a lot. So I think we need to understand people, hit them where it counts. We're not. We want everything to happen beyond us. You will see a big difference in the people who do stuff for themselves. That generation that came through the Depression, we learn a lot from them. You know, those people used everything. They valued the things they had. The thingiverse looked different at that time.
So what's an alternative to get meaning out of life if you're not just consuming?
Well, in my case, I always had that goal of creating a large art installation. I've wanted to be a fine artist all my life, and I've really confined that to a limited amount of time. So to me, to give up everything that I've got in the face of and go down to a very small home with an acreage to live off of should provide me with that opportunity as the outplay of the other decisions I've made. But I'm still doing that as a bit of a hypocrite because I built the money that's doing all of that and making it possible through a system that provided me with endless technology for decades.
Yep. Well,
I still yearn for something a little more raw, and I think I'll live longer if I'm that physical.
Right on. Listen, thanks, man. Well, that was Grant Nicholson and his take on personal consumption, and telling us as well about just how much trouble he went to downgrade everything he's doing. He's talking about his tiny home as a retirement option, but he's also been making thoughtful builds. His whole life is his home here in Owen Sound is a thoughtful build. I see that Joyce has said Grey Highlands has gotten rid of their minimum house size. Has Georgian Bluffs do the same?
In Georgian Bluffs, to my knowledge, we do not, and it's not something we've yet discussed with our climate action committee. We are just about tomorrow. We're going to advance a motion to bring in a tree cutting bylaw. Owen Sound has one, Meaford has one, Town of Blue Mountains is actually drafting one. So we're starting with trees, but small houses. I think it's a bigger issue in the Town of Blue Mountains. There's been a lot of talk over there about it, but nothing that I'm aware of in Georgian Bluffs.
Well, it's an important issue that we can and need to raise with our municipal councils and staff.
I wonder about tiny homes on large lots. What do you gain from that?
The kind of planning that we go forward with is to try and get high density occupancy, so that facilitates transportation efficiencies and local shopping opportunities. And so small homes on large lots wouldn't fit that particular model. We would want a higher density on the land that we're actually going to dedicate to housing. That's a model. It's in a number of recently revised official plans.
Well, about the tiny home, I wonder if you have a tiny home and a huge mortgage. I mean, you probably don't have a huge mortgage, but if you still have a mortgage versus you're living in a mid-size home and you have maybe small mortgage, I wonder if the mortgage is bigger than anything else, because it seems to me that feeding the corporation, the banks and whoever is benefiting from the interest and from the credits that has been established probably a few years before me coming to Canada, I kind of wonder about that. What is actually above us and who regulates all that? Thank you.
That's a good question, eh? When the mortgage is bigger than the tiny house, it doesn't serve the purpose of having a smaller footprint.
I'm really curious about Grant's suggestion of, basically repurposed materials, and where and how and who is interested in making that happen. I mean, I've been to the Restore. I have a Restore door. I have a Restore light or 3, so I've gone there. But for something that is, building an addition, building a solar, passive solar addition or something, I don't see much or hear much. So I'm wondering if other people do, of anybody who's really working on, not having stuff go to the dump, but have it go somewhere else where people can go and purchase it for the cost of, whatever it's taken to move it around. So I'm really interested in repurposed materials rather than new stuff, and wondering about what Grant knows about how you do that rather than just, taking your neighbor's cedar rails.
Well, Grant's video, and he made it pretty clear, is all about thoughtful design. So he's right on the same page. He's not here in the session tonight, so he can't answer your question. I'm sorry.
I've been looking at materials and recycled steel siding. Apparently, it's kind of a pain in the neck because has holes in it where it's been fastened previously, and so you have to work around those. But you can, and I like the idea of steel siding. And you can get it online. When I Googled it, I was taken straight to Kijiji, and there was lots of recycled steel siding available.
Thanks, Joyce.
I'd like to know about insulation. What kind of repurposed material you can use for insulation?
Karen?
Yeah, thanks. Just a call out to, I think Lorraine was asking about repurposing. We actually have a lot to repurpose at the moment because we're doing a renovation. So like built-ins and appliances and things like big, beautiful windows that are new and stuff. So how can we get in touch with you, Lorraine? And also, we're finding some success by going on Meaford Marketplace and offering things for free or for sale there. And we see other people are doing that too. So there and Kijiji is how we're doing it. But I would love to hear of other people with their suggestions.
Yeah, I would encourage Karen and Lorraine to put their email addresses in the chat. I really do want you all to meet our next presenter, because I was introduced to him through John Butler. John writes the Village Green. So he has he's put me in touch with Sean Ankerman, who's a fascinating man from who lives in Flesherton, born in this area in Stratford. He's a published author on the single-use plastics myth. So like just his experience in the restaurant business coming full tilt into plain view, and how much waste and how much packaging and how embedded the infrastructure in restaurant management is. So here is Sean, who'll give his take on how to reduce. Sean, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. As we said, I'm Sean. I want to talk about coffee and how it's not so much reducing our intake of coffee, but reducing our negative impact that coffee can have on our world, our community, a variety of things. And as Canadians, we're hooked on the double-double. I mean, people come in looking for it. We want the double-double. That's kind of a reality. It is part of our culture, we're told. But I'd like to suggest that when we order a coffee, we need to think about more than just cheap coffee that goes into the cup. We need to think about, where are we getting it? Who owns the venue where we're buying the coffee? What does that venue offer back to the community around it? How does it treat its employees? How does it treat the community? What kind of coffee is inside the cup? What about the cup itself? What do we do with our footprint? You know, the double-double is a pretty ugly footprint when we really start to pull it apart and look at what it's about. The company that produces the predominant double-double in Canada creates almost everything they have down in the Mississauga-Oakville area. They load it onto trucks and they truck it across the country. It goes from coast to coast to coast. They put it on planes. They send it overseas. When our troops were in Afghanistan, there was a lovely outlet at Kandahar at the Air Force Base, but everything had to be sent over by jet to be there for our troops. So the economic, ecological, social footprint of coffee is tremendous, and it's huge. So Flesherton is host to my coffee shop, Highland Grounds, which is fair trade organic. And if you're not sure about what fair trade is, fundamentally fair trade means that 25% of your purchase price as a consumer is returning to the grower in the country of origin. If you buy one of the brand name coffees, you're looking at maybe 2 to 5%, whereas fair trade is a commitment of a minimum of 25. Almost every fair trade company that I've worked with over the last 25 years has a reinvestment back in the country of origin. One of them, Level Ground out of British Columbia, has invested heavily in the education of young women in the countries of origin where they source their coffee. Colombia, they now have vets and nurses and teachers and doctors who have benefited from coffee that we're purchasing in Canada. You also have to look at the ecological impact of coffee. Most of the coffee you buy at the grocery stores are simply grown in large plantations. Shade-grown coffee is what fair trade is about. Shade-grown coffee means that the surrounding ecosystem is relatively intact. Usually fruit trees or the natural canopy are left there. The coffee is grown underneath. In the case of Level Ground, it's a really good example of the shade-grown fruit trees created fruit that the women of the coffee growing community went, we could do something with this. And a gentleman from the Okanagan took a fruit dehydrator down to Colombia and created a whole industry of dried fruit, which we have available here in our store and is available at other venues across Canada. And it's a female-driven industry. The men grow the coffee, the women are growing fruit and processing it and selling it. And so what was happening for a time is as the trucks were getting ready to leave the area with coffee, the women were saying, hey, hold on, we've got tons of dried fruit we want to send out. Eventually, they created their own kind of cooperative movement. And so you have a coffee truck and a fruit truck, both driving out of the area, carrying the product. So there's an economic impact. It empowers women in many ways. It empowers the young people. It empowers the whole community. It's also a better coffee. Fair trade coffee is generally a better quality than what you'll find. We have 7 roasteries that we use. We're having our 7th one hopefully coming tomorrow. They all have added focus. They have things like Cafe Femino, which is a women's cooperative that it's women growers. We have Breaking the Silence, which is a Guatemalan cooperative amongst the First Nations people of Guatemala. We have a coffee from the north that reinvests in the caribou herds across Alaska and the Yukon that are being threatened. We have one from Just Us in Nova Scotia that reinvests in the Black youth of Cape Breton Island, giving them education and employment opportunities. And so buying your coffee can have a huge impact beyond the community where you're buying it. The other part of it that's important, and this comes back to an announcement our dear Prime Minister made a few years ago when he said, we're going to eliminate single-use plastics. And everybody went, yay, that's so exciting. This is minor. The single-use plastics that you as a consumer take out the door of my store is a tiny fraction of the plastics that we deal with every single day. Our plastics, our spoons, our utensils are biocompostable, so they're bioplastics. We use paper straws. We started that, I think it was 4 years ago, a restaurant in Stratford frequented by a guy by the name of Justin Bieber, Stratford being my hometown, started promoting paper straws. And I called them and said, where did you get them? We want paper straws. We had them in within 3 or 4 days. We've changed suppliers to a company out of Toronto that has larger straws that work very well for our product, and that's what we use. And if they're left on the ground in about a week and a half, they actually disintegrate and they're gone. They biocompose quite rapidly. So that's a big piece of it. All of our takeout containers are sustainable. It reduces the footprint that's left. Most of the stuff that we have, we can also compost. The coffee grinds, I mean, being a coffee shop, we create a lot of coffee grinds, cooking meals, doing lunches. We have been composting pretty much since we opened 9 years ago. It began with compost bins around my home at the time. Then we moved it to the church that I was serving here in Flesherton. And over a couple of years, we were growing squash and zucchini, which we would bring down and use in our kitchens for the muffins and for breads and things. Last year, we actually were selling them. We had so many. For a time, we were supplying a worm farm down in the Caledon area. And she would come and pick up all of our food waste, and it was able to feed the worms, which in turn created a compost that we can sell and that she was selling. And right now we've been, over the last year, supplying our compost to a neighbor out in Priceville who uses it for his gardens and has created some beautiful gardens with amazing soil. The other aspect for us is we also recycle a lot. We put out 2 bags of recycling to every bag of garbage. And the garbage that goes out is probably the greatest frustration that I have as a store owner. 90% of what goes into that garbage bag is non-recyclable plastic. It's the stuff that comes in the kitchen door, the things that come from our suppliers, the food containers that we are using to create the baking and create the food that we offer to our customers. And it's non-recyclable. And there's no reason it has to be non-recyclable. It could be cardboard, it could be glass, it could be recyclable plastic. But the supply chain that we've talked about before has made that choice, that it's plastic that's not recyclable. We will recycle everything we can. And that's where the article that I was published about comes in. It was for the United Church Observer back when it was still the Observer, not the Broadview as it's called now. And over a space of 3 days, I gathered all of the non-recyclable plastic. And we had a pile that was about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. The picture I took of it was quite startling. There's so much plastic that comes into our business every single day. And we try to recycle everything that we can, but this was the stuff that couldn't be recycled. And we try, we do everything we can to reduce that footprint, but that's the reality. So when our Prime Minister is saying, oh, we're going to reduce single-use plastic that's going out the front door, I've been saying for 5-6 years, reduce the plastic that's coming in the back door. It's probably more of a problem than anybody realizes. And it's easy for us to just dump everything in the garbage, put it out at the curb. The municipality takes it away, problem solved. My conscience won't let me do that. We're fair trade, organic, and local. So what we're about is making sure our footprint's reduced. Like I said, we compost, we recycle. Our pile of cardboard that goes out every 2 weeks is enormous. We make sure all of our cardboard gets recycled. All of our paper gets recycled. That's one way of doing it. But as a consumer, the way to reduce the footprint is to ask questions. To ask questions about where does the product come from? How is it produced? Is it from a large corporation? Is it from a smaller venue? Our roasteries are all the 7 that we use are relatively small. Some of them are large cooperatives like Just Us and Level Ground. They've been around for quite a while. They've got a world reach. But it's important to ask the question of where are they from? How do they treat their employees? How do they treat their suppliers? The shift to using more organic and local is important too. Where does the food come from? With the coming of the pandemic, we had to pivot as a business and eliminate our in-house seating. We replaced it with freezers and with food. Have become more of a grocery store to our community. So we have local meats and fishes that come, local meat and fish that come from producers that are close by. They do grass pastured with the beef and pork, grass pasture with the chicken. The fish are sustainably raised and harvested, and it's local. So it's not traveling 12,000 miles to come here to be on our plate. It's traveling 12 kilometers. It's traveling 15 miles. Like, it's very close by. We've started bringing in organic produce where we can get it. We use local. Local producers bring their product to us and we can resell it. But we prioritize organic. We make sure that what we're bringing in is the highest quality available. Our business model has shifted through the pandemic and it's been successful for us. We have become a grocery store, a general store to the Flesherton community. But it's important, and the fundamental for me is how do we reduce our footprints? We've talked about it. John started talking about kind of the whole supply chain issue. We looked at that. We found ways of reducing our impact on the supply chain, making sure our carbon footprint is as minimal as it can be. So it's making choices, opting for fair trade, opting for organic, being very aware of the social conscience aspect of being a consumer who's informed and educated about what they're eating. You want good product for your family. Our goal is to supply it. The source, where are you getting it from? Who's making it? How are they benefiting? To me, fair trade coffee comes down to making a difference in the world, reducing our consumption of the bad stuff, but making sure that we're having a positive impact on the world around us. And so when I buy coffee that I know is grown by a producer who's being treated fairly, whose children are being educated, there's a medical clinic being built in their community by the coffee company. All of those things are important. And that doesn't happen if you're buying Nescafe or Maxwell House or any of the big brands. They say they're sustainable, but they're not really having that footprint. It makes a difference. We as a consumer here buying a coffee can make a huge difference somewhere else. And that's the important piece of it, to make sure that we reduce that negative impact as we live as consumers and that we minimize our footprint, as Grant said. I think that was one of the best lessons there. So that's kind of what I have to say. And I'll throw it back to you, Lee, and if we have any questions.
Thanks for that take on that. You're welcome. Actually, you're the gatherer of questions. It looks like there's a bunch for Sean.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Sean, that you really talk a lot about being different than the big corporations in your work and in your business. The questions are mostly around the packaging, in the packaging of food, like the cups and all these kind of things, and which you say that come out through the front door, which you think are kind of not as significant as the stuff that comes in through the back door. But still, I think there's maybe some thoughts around how would you actually, if you can, compare like your footprint that goes out the front door compared to big corporations, Tim Hortons, for instance.
Well, we're not as big, so you're not going to see as much Highland Ground stuff out on the highways like you do Tim Hortons. Our cups are compostable. I mean, they are from a supplier out of Toronto with they're biocompostable, they're bio, they don't have the plastic liner the same way. So I did a test a couple of years ago in a compost bin and threw some cups in to see how long it took, and it didn't take very long. They say it takes about 1.5 years for this cup to compost in a commercial composter, but in my backyard one, it took about 6 months and they were gone. So that's the reduction right out of the gate. The product that we choose, it's not about the logo, it's not about the consistency. It's also not being trucked all over the country. We bring it in by the pallet load, so that we're reducing that shipping part. And the cups they're gone in relatively short time if they're left out in the environment rolling around. My preference would be that people put them in the garbage receptacles, but it's the least negative impact that we can offer. And I'm noticing too, there's questions coming up about refillables. Yes, we do refill. We hit them with steam when we get them handed to us. The protocols are all public health wise. They say you shouldn't with COVID, or you need to take precautions. So we wash our hands, we clean the cup, we put the coffee in, and then we wipe everything down afterwards. So we take the precautions on our side, and we welcome refillable cups. We always have. We had to stop for a while when COVID first started, simply because nobody really knew. But now we do. We do it all the time. We have many regulars who come in with their refillables. So,
well, it shows that you're quite flexible in adjusting to realities and changing realities.
Yes,
I guess that the large corporations do not do, as far as I know. When we go to a coffee shop, you cannot bring a refillable cup. You can bring it, but they don't fill it.
Yeah.
I'll share quickly what's going on the whiteboard, because there's some interesting comments. I'll take over your screen for a minute, and you can see a whole bunch of people put post-it notes up. So thinking back more broadly, and then I think we'll go back to the presenters in a minute for their thoughts on some of these. How do you reduce your impact on the earth? A lot of you in the call today. Looks like Eat Local. The Eat Local Grey Bruce is an amazing resource. To keep things local and supply chain short. By reducing, I'm focusing on increasing my community involvement and making a positive impact on the earth. Yeah, so spreading initiative, acting. People like Grant in the interview, just like where the rubber hits the road, going out and doing something. consistently growing indoor sprouts through the non-growing season. Yeah. Geothermal, donating. Geez, fair trade coffee. That's right up your alley. And a big shout out to Glassworks, because they seem to be an organization, a co-op actually, that is doing everything right in their planning. We look forward to seeing some action on their new land in Owen Sound.
And they will have also tiny houses included. It said earlier on the chat. Can you talk about Starbucks coffee? Is their coffee sustainable, fair trade?
To my knowledge, no. They have some lines of coffee that they claim are, but as a corporate, I mean, it's a corporation. It is about making money. The reading and research that I've done on it, it's sustainable from a profit point of view, but not necessarily for the growers. They've done a lot to improve over the last 10 or 15 years, but they have a long way to go. Ironically, McDonald's as a corporation has done more around sustainability, as has A&W as a corporation, than almost any other businesses, but most of them, it's profit. It really takes time to do the reading and the research, and a lot of coffee companies are very secretive. But what's happening today is the big corporations like Lavazza are buying up a lot of the fair trade roasteries to be able to say, look, we have a fair trade coffee, but they haven't changed their business model. They haven't addressed kind of what John had talked about earlier. How do you do business differently where you value people over profit? They simply buy up a company to be able to slap the label out and say, look, we're sustainable now. They're not. They haven't changed fundamentally. They're just acquiring new businesses, acquiring more stuff, as is their want.
And that's probably true when we buy coffee at the supermarket, fair trade coffee. It's probably
it's the logo. You want to see the fair trade logo on the product, or the sustainable logo, or that it's a direct trade coffee. That's vitally important when it comes to any product, like bananas, sugar, chocolate especially. Chocolate's probably even worse than coffee in terms of how it treats its growers in the countries of origin. So looking for fair trade, direct and sustainable labeling is very, very important as a consumer.
Nice. Sean, there's a question. How long does it take for these items to decompose, like the cutlery?
The cutlery, I'm not as sure of. It doesn't take, because we've only been carrying this for about a year and a bit, and I don't have access to compost in the same way. But what it has said on the packaging when we get it, it takes about 12 to 18 months for it to completely disappear.
If John, if you're still there, we've had. I really want to tie together the idea of what can we all do locally? Like we always talk in this forum about what people in Gray and Bruce and the traditional home of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation can do. So John, if you're still with us, feel free to unmute. John, we've got you saying that there's a lot of things that the government can do, and we've got Grant, our tiny home man, saying that everyone's got to create a connection with the land and start acting, because heaven knows you can't convince someone else if they're already entrenched. And then we've got Sean, who's providing some ways to do it. But John, what do you say to the other takes?
Well, like I started my talk, every sector has a role to play, and every sector can take steps to improve the situation. The thing is that on the individual basis, and when you work through any of these calculators and try and reduce your footprint, you find you cannot get very far. You can often make a 20% reduction without a serious impact on your lifestyle, like selling your house and quitting your job. But governments, they have a huge role. And one of the talking points that I've been at forever are the subsidies that our government still gives to the fossil fuel sector. If those subsidies simply switched, and these are depending what source you look at, it's over $1 billion a year just in Canada. We shift those to the transition to renewable energy. If we shift those to being more efficient in the way we use our energy, that's a huge role, and that's government. That's our money that our government is using. Now, you could argue, well, we have the change and we can vote the change in and out. Well, then, okay, then yes, indeed, it's back to us. And look at like the news today. I mean, when Doug Ford came into the government in Ontario, he was ripping out EV charging stations, and he eliminated the subsidy to help people make that transition. Many people don't have the deep pockets that the wealthy do and can't make those kind of transitions easily. And now President Biden in the States is, what I heard on the radio today was up to a $14,000 subsidy, tax subsidy for people that are going to switch to an EV. I mean, these are policy decisions by government, and they're huge in driving that. You go back 100 years ago, I think it was 2009 in the US, they passed the Sherman Act. And that was the first, that was the big monopoly that broke up the large monopolies that had formed, and it created huge wealth in the hands of a few in the States. And then FDR's New Deal, when people were starving and were rioting and rioters are being shot by the police forces, the government's acted. So governments have a huge role to play, but they've got to respond to society, and society has to be behind them when they make these decisions. This is why it's all connected.
Yeah, that's why the question that Jim had earlier, can governments incentivize corporations to reduce their consumption? At the end, it depends on us, the people, the society, to put pressure on governments to do that. And I know from Europe that there was more pressure for a long time from green parties and so on and green movement to make policy changes.
The chat is really active. I've got Simona saying that every compost is different, and if red wigglers are involved, they would love cutlery for our cutlery question. We'll do some closing comments. We'll go back to Sean and then to John, and then I'll take over. So just for a couple of minutes and your final thoughts.
Okay. I want to actually do a plug for our neighboring business here in town. About a year and a half ago, we needed to expand, and we purchased the building next door to us with the intention of expanding into the sustainable household, cleaners, cleanser, all that kind of stuff. COVID hit, didn't happen. But we happened along upon a young woman who has a business called Eco Refillery that does that. She refills the soaps and the shampoos and the cleaners. She has a huge variety of household products that are all sustainably sourced and so on. And it was a good fit. We agreed as a landlord-tenant that she would focus on the household side, we'd focus on the food side, and we've built two businesses side by side that complement each other very well and are able to send people back and forth. And I think that's also the key is cooperation within communities of bringing in what you can to kind of create almost like a shopping mall in a small town so that people don't have to travel the long ways to pick things up and to get things, or, increase the wealth of the corporations like Amazon by phoning and saying, can we get this delivered? It's about bringing it in and also recognizing, do you really need it? Like some things you don't. I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I think it's about growing your economy, and it's about building a business and building the economy in the community and doing what you can to help your neighbors. And we've been trying for 9 years and having a lot of fun. We've learned a lot. We've made mistakes, but we're having a good time. And I think we're making a difference. And I think that's the key. Just keep growing and keep trying to bring good product into the market. So.
I commend you. The rubber is hitting the road in Flesherton.
Just looking at how active the chat has been, I think talking about these issues and discussing solutions and sharing ideas, I think that's huge. And I just, I'm glad to be a part of it. And my congratulations to everybody that participated tonight.
Thanks, John. And I know I've learned a lot. I'm also now I'd remiss if I didn't mention the comment from Dean about B Corps, and B Corps are another great way to spend your dollars wisely and speak with your wallet. Thanks. And yeah, we're just taking a stab at this issue from a local perspective, like we always do. You're welcome. Do you have a parting comment?
Well, I mean, John, you just talked about the conversation is so important, and the chat is a great conversation. But it's also encouraging when we listen to the radio, like CBC, that there's a lot of conversations these days around climate change and climate action. So I think I think if we talk globally about it, locally about it, it makes it to a more global arena as well. That was a great evening, and yeah, I think there was a lot of information about what we can do personally and the impacts, but also how we can impact on the bigger politics. There were some chats around impacting on our banks, like everybody has invested money in some way, directly or indirectly. And I think it's important to put pressure on them. I do this. I send articles all the time to my bank whenever something comes up and say, do something about it. And I don't have time to do it myself. Anyway, so thanks again, everybody. And so we meet again on the 16th of December for the last forum this year. Yeah, see, it's right there. Thanks, Lee. And we are still working on the topic of that one. It might be about e-vehicles, which is also a big step towards reducing our footprint. Yeah, so, and if anybody has suggestions, you're always welcome to write to us, and we incorporate this into our topics.
All right, so until December 16th, thanks a lot to our speakers. We appreciate that. We appreciate the time you donated to this. And take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lee. It was
Save the chat.
been a blast.
All right.